Thanks for joining everyone who's on so far. We'll get started in about 7:05.
Maybe this could be a time when folks could put some information in the chat. We would love to know a little bit about those of you who are joining us this evening, and we'll introduce ourselves when we get started. But I'm Sarah Martinez from Erikson Institute. I'm here with my colleague, Alli Lowe-Fotos from Start Early. If you would just put a little something in the chat about what brought you here this evening, if you are a professional in the mental health field, if you are here just for your own personal interest, whatever you'd like to share, we would love to hear a little bit about you. And if there's anything you're hoping to hear this evening, let us know that too, so we can make sure that we address um, your areas of interest. Oh, thank you, folks who are putting it in there already. School social worker, great. Wellness program coordinator. Oh, and a foster mom. Wonderful. Thank you, Dawn. Welcome. Children's therapist. Oh, excellent. Oh, great. Thank you, Andrea. You know, we talk often about kind of the intersection of perinatal mental health and infant mental health and how much overlap there is between those two fields, and how we can connect and work together with folks who are treating expectant parents as well. Teacher and grandma, yay.
Okay, it's 7:05. We can get started. Um, Thanks everyone for joining us. So glad to have you all, and thanks to our panelists. Um, so, um, Tonight's webinar is called Defining and Understanding Infant and Early Childhood Mental Health, and that's brought to you by Nnamdi County North Suburban. and Alli Lowe-Fotos from Start Early, and Sarah Martinez from Erikson Institute. So, Start Early is a national nonprofit organization that promotes early childhood development in under-resourced communities by working directly with children and families, supporting and training the early childhood workforce, and partnering at the local, state, and federal levels to ensure policies put families first. And then the Erikson Institute is a graduate school for early childhood development, education, and social work that prepares professionals to address the challenges that young children, families, and communities face. The Institute offers innovative programs, research, and advocacy to empower early childhood professionals. So my name's Courtney. I'm the Adult and Family Programs Manager at NAMI Cook County North Suburban. If you're not familiar with NAMI, we're one of the nation's largest grassroots mental health organizations that provide public awareness, no-cost support, and education programs online and in person so that people and families affected by mental health conditions can build better lives. We offer classes, support groups, presentations, and advocate for mental health. Our programs are free and open to those in our community service areas. So this year, each month, we've been doing this for about 2 or 3 years now, these webinars. We have mental health professionals join us and dig deep into a variety of topics to further educate us on just topics of interest of our community members. So for this workshop, we're going to understand and define infant early childhood mental health and its guiding principles. We will discuss early childhood trauma, discuss approaches and practices for attending to infant early childhood mental health, and introduce the diagnostic classification of mental health and developmental disorders of infancy and early childhood. We will also learn the importance of observing and noticing behavioral changes in young children and be introduced to the diagnostic process. So we will have a Q&A at the end of the presentation. But if you want to, we have a Q&A feature, so you can use that if you want to be anonymous, but we also have a chat that you can type in to, so you can type into that during the presentation, but we will answer questions at the end or type into it when we hold the Q&A. So I'm just going to introduce our guest speakers. So Sarah Martinez, she's a member of the faculty at the Erikson Institute in Chicago, where she's a co-director of the Infant and Early Childhood Mental Health Certificate Program and the Master's Degree in Child Development with Infancy Specialization Program. Sarah holds a master's degree in clinical psychology from the Illinois School of Professional Psychology and a master's degree in early childhood special education from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Sarah's bachelor's degree is in special education from Vanderbilt University. Sarah is a member of the board of directors of the Illinois Association for Infant Mental Health, where she has served as president and secretary. Sarah is a frequent presenter on topics of infant and early childhood mental health, attachment, and parent-child relationships. Our other guest speaker, Allison, has her MSW and LCSW and is a senior policy manager with Start Early. She works on issues and initiatives of mental health, home visiting, early childhood expulsion, child welfare, families impacted by the criminal legal system, and early childhood workforce development. She has been an adjunct professor with the Erikson Institute since 2020. She has previously worked in direct practice and early childhood education programs, providing case management, family support work, therapy with children and families, infant early childhood mental health consultation, and supervising a teen parent home visiting program. She also has international experience working in programs and projects in China, Mexico, and Turkey. Allison has a BS in psychology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, an MSW from Loyola University Chicago, and is credentialed in infant mental health. So we're really thrilled to have them here tonight to further educate us on this topic. So I'm honored to welcome our guest speakers, Sarah and Allison and Alli.
Thanks, Courtney.
Thanks, everyone, for having us. We're really excited to be here. Sarah and I have known each other for a long time mostly through our initial connection of being on the board of the Infant Mental Health Association. But it's always a pleasure to collaborate with Sarah. She's fabulous at what she does. But Courtney, if you'd like to go ahead and share our slides, you did a great introduction, so we really don't need to introduce ourselves anymore. If you want to go to slide 2, I'll hand it over to Sarah.
That sounds good. And we kind of did a little bit already on slide 2. So Courtney, hearing from you about who you are, and it gives us a good, foundation to think about what you're bringing to this work and to our time together today. And what we would love to know from you, if you want to put something in the chat, is what do you think of when you hear the term infant and early childhood mental health? I think, in our world today, it's becoming more frequently heard, but there are still folks out there who say, babies have mental health? What are you talking about? And who maybe think of it like this. Courtney, can you put our next slide? That we picture this baby laying on the couch with the Freudian analyst stroking his beard, taking notes about the baby's stream of consciousness, jargoning and babbling. But really, this is not what infant and early childhood mental health is all about. And what we're going to talk more about today is what it really is all about. But let's see what we've got in the chat here. Dawn says trauma. That definitely we are going to talk about today. And Andrew says, I assume there's some sort of trauma when I think of infant mental health. So that is definitely a part of what we think about when we think of infant mental health. But there's a whole lot more as well. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Early childhood anxiety and depression, that is part of it as well. But when we think about infant mental health, we really think about the health piece of it as well. There's lots of definitions out there in our field. But the one that gets used the most frequently, particularly in the research literature, comes from the organization 0 to 3. If you're not familiar with 0 to 3 and you're interested in infancy and early childhood, learning about development and a host of support and developmental kinds of literature and supports, check out the 0 to 3 website. They have amazing resources for families and for clinicians and practitioners. But their definition of infant and early childhood mental health is the one that's most frequently seen in the research literature. So it encompasses several different areas. And what 0 to 3 says is that infant mental health, or infant and early childhood mental health, is the developing capacity of the infant and the toddler to form relationships, to have relationships that are close, that are secure, with a primary caregiver, with the other adult caregivers in their lives, and with peers. We don't often think about baby to baby relationships, but so many infants and toddlers are in group care these days. Those peer relationships become a really important aspect of their very early lives. Then we think about the child's capacity to experience a wide range of emotions, to regulate and manage those emotions, to have a variety of different affects that they experience, and to do it within a range, and to be able to regulate themselves so that they're in a state where they can take in new information and learn. And they do that by exploring the environment, taking in new information, storing it in memory for use later on. So there's really multiple capacities that come into play when we think about what it means when we think about a baby's mental health. The key, though, is that all of this unfolds primarily within the context of relationship. The relationships with family, with community, and then with the culture as a whole. Because we know that culture deeply impacts parenting and caregiving practices in families. And those caregiving practices form the basis of the relationship between the parent and the child. And those relationships can look really different from a cultural lens. But we think about the healthy social and emotional development of the baby within the context of relationship, within the context of environment, so that the child develops in all areas of their development: motor, language, social and emotional, self-help, what did I forget? Cognition. All of those capacities are unfolding within the context of that primary care relationship. Okay, you can go to the next slide, Courtney. So then we think about what infant mental health is not. It's not focused exclusively on mental illness in young children. While we know that that is a possibility and that children do experience conditions like anxiety and depression very early on, what infant mental health tells us is that if we get in early and support that child, support the parent-child relationship, it's much more likely that that will move the child in a much more healthy trajectory in their development. The other key is it's not focused exclusively on young children who are already identified as being at risk. And it's not focused just on infants and young children. Infant and early childhood mental health is really focused on relationships. We very much consider the parent, the primary caregivers, the foster parent, the grandparent, whoever is the most important people in the lives of that young child, are very much considered when we think from an infant and early childhood mental health lens. So it's not exclusively synonymous with social emotional development, although that's a big part of it. We think about the relationships, we think about the development of the child, we think about their regulatory capacities, and then we think about that within multiple contexts: the relational context, the family context, the community context, and the culture as a whole. We think about the needs and the strengths of the baby. We think about the needs and the strengths of the primary caregivers. And we think about the needs and the strengths in the relationship. And all of those things together make up infant and early childhood mental health. We can go on to the next one. So when we think from this infant mental health lens, we think about some guiding principles. And one of the first principles that is really foundational to an infant and early childhood mental health lens is that it's strengths-based. That when we are supporting a dyad, supporting a baby and their caregiver, we're always focusing on where are the areas in this relationship where things are going well, that we can build on for this dyad to support them and facilitate growth. Of course, we're looking for those areas where there are challenges, where the dyad is struggling, so that we can bring in additional supports. But we very much approach our work from a strengths-based lens. When we're talking to families, we point out the things that are going well for them. We highlight the areas where the parent is really effective in supporting their child's development. We point out the child's developmental capacities and strengths. And we do this all within the lens of culture. When we think from an infant mental health lens, we don't think from a lens of cultural competence. We think from a lens of cultural humility. When we think of ourselves as infant and early childhood mental health practitioners, we take a very humble stance. Say, there is so much going on in this dyad, in this family, that I don't know about. Even if the family comes from a culture that's very similar to my own, they may have very different ways of expressing that in their parenting relationships, in their family structure, in the values and beliefs that they hold. And so my role as an infant mental health informed practitioner is to hold a stance of openness and be teachable, to learn from the family what their deeply held cultural values and beliefs and practices are, so that I can show respect for those and understand the relationship with their baby within that context. The other really significant foundational concept in our infant and early childhood mental health work is the importance of brain science. Understanding what's happening in the development of this baby or young child based on their neurobiology and what that's telling us about what their capacities are. Let's go to the next slide and look a little bit deeper at the brain piece. The period of time that we focus on primarily in infant and early childhood mental health is prenatal through about age 5. All of brain development is happening at just an exponential rate during prenatal development. And on up through the first 18 months of life, synapses, the neuronal connections that fire messages one to the other, are developing just constantly, growing, growing, growing. And what's driving the development of those neuronal connections is the experience that the baby has. Those things that catch their interest, that fascinate them, particularly the things that happen in the context of relationship. Things like language, engagement. When we play peekaboo with the baby, where's mommy? Here I am. The surprise, the anticipation, all of those incredible interactions are building neural pathways within the baby's brain. And it's happening at this just accelerated rate in those first several months of life. What's also happening is the aspects of interaction and brain function that aren't being used as much are being pruned away to make brain function very efficient. As the baby continues to grow, the synapses that are forming create higher and higher cognitive function for the baby. And they continue to build their capacities in all of their developmental areas. When we think about this brain science piece, think about 90% of brain growth happens in the first 36 months of the child's life. The brain weight of the baby is at 90% capacity in the first 3 years of life. When you think about how significant that is, everything that's happening in development for that baby during those initial periods, it's really quite striking. When we look at a PET scan, a computerized image of a child's brain, a child who's grown and been nurtured in an environment that is good enough, not perfect, but an environment where their cries are responded to and their needs are met and they have lots of interaction, that baby lights up all over the PET scan. You see bright colors. When we look at the brain scans of babies who have grown up in neglectful environments, where they've spent a lot of time alone in their crib, where they've cried for long periods of time without being attended to, their brains are structurally smaller, and the lit up areas that show the firing of the synapses are much more dull. Experience drives brain development. Relationships drive brain development. So babies who grow in environments that are rich and are stimulating, particularly relationally, have bigger brains. Bigger brains means more surface area. More surface area means more neuronal connections. Better capacity to take in information from the environment, store that information in memory, learn new things, and be able to retrieve it for use later. So, when we think from a purely developmental standpoint, neurologically, relationships drive development. It's a really significant and important aspect of an infant mental health approach. So as we go along, if you have questions or thoughts or information that you want to share from your own work or practice or your own experience, please feel free to put it in the chat. I don't think the way this is set up, you can unmute yourself and say it, but you can for sure put it in the chat, and we'd love to hear from you as we go forward. Okay, Courtney, we can go to the next one. So there are just a few basic concepts that come together to form an infant mental health approach. And the one I've kind of hammered home already, but definitely bears repeating, is that development begins and development is fostered within the context of relationship. The attachment relationship between the parent and the baby is where the baby internalizes all of their later social and emotional functions, all of their later intellectual function. Think about the baby who, brand new baby, just born. Babies do not come out of the womb ready to regulate themselves. They need help to be able to do that. And any of you who've cared for a newborn knows the incredible extent you will go to soothe that baby. You hold them, you swaddle them, you bounce them, you shh in their ear, you sing to them, you put their little seat on top of the dryer so they get a little vibration. You put them in the swing, you swing them in your arms, you hold them, you pat them, you walk them. All of those ministrations that we are providing for that baby, that are helping that baby to feel soothed and to feel calmed, because we are helping them to regulate their nervous system. As those functions are provided by a loving, available, safe, nurturing caregiver over and over again in a pattern of predictability, become internalized for the baby. And over time, the child begins to be able to provide those functions for themselves. That's the development of regulation. It starts with co-regulation, the parent providing all of these external forces for the child. But with each repeated interaction, the baby begins to take in a little bit more and a little bit more, so that they begin to be able to provide those functions for themselves. And as they grow and develop, those functions are internalized. And by the time they reach adulthood, they're able to provide those functions for another baby. And so the cycle continues. The other piece that's really quite essential is the environment in which all of this happens. If those soothing functions are provided by a caregiver who's calm and regulated themselves, in an environment that feels calm and regulated, the baby takes that in as well. If the environment is chaotic, if the environment is tense, if the caregiver is very, very anxious about what's happening in their life or in their world, those experiences are communicated to the baby as well. Environment matters in other ways too. Is this baby breathing healthy air? Is the baby getting nutritious food? Is the baby safe when they're out walking around the neighborhood? All of those factors deeply influence how the baby's development unfolds over time, impacts the baby's social emotional skills, as well as their development of language and cognition and motor skills, self-help, social emotional regulation, all unfold within that context of the relationship and the environment. We can go on to the next one. So this is a video that comes from the work of a researcher at the University of Massachusetts in Boston by the name of Ed Tronick. And some of you may have seen this before. It's called the still face experiment. And what he did was brought mothers and babies into a lab and asked the mother to play with her baby as she would at home. And you can see there's a split screen video. So you can see the baby's face and you can see the mother's face, but they are face to face with one another. And then the researchers signal the mom and she goes blank, stops interacting with her baby and becomes unavailable to the baby. And let's watch and see how the baby reacts when this happens.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
Oh, my girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it. They actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
So you can see just how powerful that parental interaction is for a young baby. And this is a parent where clearly there's a lovely connection between this mom and this baby. And we see the baby being very adaptive in her attempts to pull her mom back in, but she pretty quickly becomes dysregulated when she doesn't get that expected response because she's internalized the expectation that my mom won't be available to me. My mom will respond to me. And when that doesn't happen, that dysregulates her world. And she tries all her different approaches to pull her mom back in. And when it doesn't work, the dysregulation escalates. Now, as the mom comes back to her, in infant mental health terms, we would say there was a rupture in that relationship. And then the mom came back and created a repair. She soothes her with a very soft tone of voice. I'm here. Yes, giving the baby an attuned response that said, I see that was hard for you when I was away from you. And lets the baby know just through her tone, I'm with you. I'm available to you again. I understand where you're coming from. That's internalized as well, that sense of attunement and empathy that the parent validates their child's experience, which is part of the way that the baby develops those skills to use in relationships later on in life. So I would love to keep talking about this, but I'm also noticing that we need to move on. And
Hold
I
on,
need
Sarah, real quick. I want to
Alli.
interject a few things. One, this video is of a white family, a Caucasian family, but it has been replicated with many different ethnicities and cultures. It just, people's interactions may look different, because one thing that we talk about is, it's not, you don't always have to be this like calm, soothing affect. That's not the normal necessarily like bar that everyone sets. Different people have different personalities. They have different energies at different times. And it's that interplay with the baby. Also, I love that, Sarah, you brought up the repair, because often when we watch these videos or we're talking about, being there for your child and helping them self-regulate, we expect that we have to be perfect as caregivers, and we don't. Ed Tronick is amazing, and he says, life is messy. Expect the messy. That's normal. It's when there's a repair and you can come back and be together, and that actually teaches the child things as well. And so take a little ease and pressure off of yourself as a caregiver, that you don't have to be perfect. It's really about that interplay and that coming back together.
That's such an important point. And in some other research that Tronick has done, he found that the most highly attuned parent-child dyads are really only like completely in sync with each other about 30% of the time, which is like, wow, that's not a lot, but that's enough. It's good enough. There's a British psychoanalyst that's very well known in the infant mental health world who coined the term the good enough mother. That what babies need is someone who is good enough. None of us are perfect. We're all going to have ruptures in our interaction and relationship with our baby. And what really helps is to come back and repair. We're never going to be perfectly attuned. And that helps our babies develop resilience. In those moments when it's like I become really dysregulated, okay, I've got this. I can do this. I have internalized some of this good stuff from my mom, so I can call on that to get myself through in these moments. And that builds resilience in babies as well. But I'm going to turn it over to Alli, and we're going to shift gears just a little bit.
Thanks. Yeah, so a lot of you have mentioned trauma in the chat, and that we definitely can't talk about infant and early childhood mental health without talking about trauma. And if any of you are familiar with this study that's decades old at this point, it's the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, and it looks at that it found that people with a greater number of adverse childhood experiences had more health problems as adults. And so these things above the ground are the original, what we call ACEs, so things like abuse or substance abuse, domestic violence. But as the years went on, that environment and that culture piece and societal piece and that systemic piece really came in as well. And these are all of the kind of hidden things underneath that can also that are also considered the expanded ACEs. Next slide. And so when we talk about trauma, you'll find this definition that actually the Illinois Childhood Trauma Coalition was pretty instrumental in helping develop at a national level. But it's the 3 E's: the experience of an event by a child that is emotionally painful or distressful, which often results in lasting mental and physical effects. And so children can experience trauma as early as infancy. Young kids between the ages of 0 and 5 are actually the most vulnerable to the effects of trauma because, as we've talked about, their brains are still in their early formative years. The issue is that babies and young children, they don't have the understanding to process what's going on around them yet, and they don't have the language yet to express what they're feeling. And bad things happen in life as kids grow up. Some things are pretty noticeable, like a natural disaster that might destroy a home, a car accident, the death of a parent, but it can also be community violence or experiencing chronic homelessness, or even something like a child overhearing frequent, intense arguments between their parents can be traumatic for some children. But learning how to understand and process and cope with difficulties, even tragedies, that can be a natural part of child development process. But sometimes kids do get stuck. An experience, especially if it's a repeated experience, it may leave a child with an overwhelming sense of fear or loss, making them feel like they have no safety or control over their lives. And this actually activates the body's stress response, which releases brain-changing hormones and chemicals into the system. And there are 3 types of stress response. There's the positive, which is experiencing some level of optimal stress, like the first day of school. And that's actually helpful and important. My daughter is 9 and she just had her first day of school today, and she was both nervous and excited, she said. So I said, that's totally normal. There's also tolerable stress, which is serious. So like the death of a family member, or an illness or a natural disaster. But this impact of this stress is buffered by a supportive relationship and a safe environment. But then there's toxic stress, and that's prolonged activation of the stress response system in the absence of that protective relationship. There can also be historical or intergenerational trauma that gets passed down by generations. So things like the Holocaust or racism. And when we've talked about the relationships and the environments that kids live in, we can't talk about childhood trauma without also talking about adult trauma, which can really affect a parent or caregiver's ability to engage with their child. Kids suffering from trauma arrive at school less engaged and less ready to learn. It can diminish their concentration, their memory, their organizational, their language abilities. It can also lead them to be more at risk for delinquency due to a learned distrust or a disregard for adults or rules. And trauma symptoms often manifest as challenging behaviors, and it can be misdiagnosed or misinterpreted. And so one simple way to think of a trauma-informed approach is not to ask, well, what's wrong with this child, but what happened to this child? Next slide. And so while we've talked a lot about how infant and early childish mental health is strengths-based, it's a really complex issue, and we do have to acknowledge that when there are bigger issues and acknowledge that very young children can meet the diagnostic criteria of a mental health diagnosis. We do have a diagnostic manual. It's called the Diagnostic Classification of Mental Health Disorders of Infancy and Early Childhood. Whew, that's a big long name. It's basically called the DC 0 to 5 for short. But it is like the adult DSM, but for young children. And Sarah's going to talk more about that later, because for some kids, it is appropriate for them to have a diagnosis, which will then in turn lead to those interventions that can improve outcomes. Next slide. And so what does it look like in young children? Well, all behavior has meaning, first of all, and some behaviors are easier for adults to understand than others, because each child, they come with their own experiences, their expectations, their history, and behavior is how they communicate by using facial expressions, body movements, sounds. Challenging behavior is actually a normal part of child development, because as kids go through developmental stages and changes, these milestones can create periods of challenging behaviors. And this actually offers touch points or opportunities for caregivers to teach kids new skills. Every child is going to become angry, distracted at times, and will go through these challenging behaviors as they reach different stages of brain development. But when parents or caregivers really notice significant changes in behaviors, then we need to pay attention. So things like changes in feeding and toileting and sleeping habits, excessive externalizing behavior problems. So, loud noises, hitting, biting, internalizing behavior problems. So withdrawing and being anxious and fearful, regressions to earlier stages of development. And again, some of these behaviors are normal and a normal part of development, but when they are constant and extreme and very much impact the child's daily life, then that can be signs that it's something more. Next slide. And so we've talked a lot about misinterpreting kids' behavior and, kids exhibiting challenging behavior. They can show up in a lot of different systems and different ways, and there are disproportionalities because overall 50 to 80% of kids in need of mental health services actually do not receive them. And there are variances across certain groups. And so studies have shown that Black and Latinx kids receive mental health and substance abuse care were about half of those of their non-Hispanic white counterparts. And psychiatric and behavioral problems among minority youth often result in school punishment or incarceration, but rarely mental health care. And also, many mental health providers don't have the staff that are adequately trained in very young children. And so there can be misinterpretations, misdiagnoses, and these kids can show up in early intervention or early childhood special education. Kids in preschool and in infants and toddlers are more likely to be expelled from their childcare or preschool programs. Yes, that's actually a thing. And in Illinois, we have a law that is that prohibits it, but it still happens. Kids who are in the child welfare system or kids impacted by incarceration, children in mixed immigration status families, and from families experiencing mental health or substance use issues can exhibit they can exhibit more challenging behavior, but they can also be misinterpreted or misdiagnosed. And then the COVID pandemic really had a huge impact on pretty much all of our mental health, but especially our children. Next slide. But I do want to take a step back and pivot and, adverse childhood experiences, they do not dictate the future of the child. We have protective factors, things like positive physical development, high self-esteem, emotional self-regulation, coping skills, problem-solving skills, family relationships that provide structure, limits, rules, predictability, mentors, and support for development. And then there are those risk factors. So low self-esteem, mental health concerns, insecure attachment, physical issues, stressful events, environmental factors like community violence or pollution, environmental factors. Next slide. But we want to focus on our use of language and when we talk about at risk, because while trauma and mental health challenges should rightfully give us cause for concern, it's really important to recognize the tremendous opportunity that we have to shape development positively as we recognize the strengths that already exist within a child, a family, or a community that can be built upon. And we need to be strengths-based and talk about those protective factors as well as the risk factors. So the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard describes resilience as the ability to overcome serious hardship. And one way to understand the development of resilience is to visualize this balance scale or the seesaw, where protective experiences and coping skills on one side counterbalance significant adversity on the other. Resilience is evident when a child's health and development tips toward those positive outcomes, even if there's a heavy load of factors that's stacked on that negative side. And the single most common factor for kids who develop resilience is at least one stable and committed relationship with a supportive parent or caregiver or other adult. And while you hope that that adult is a parent, it can be anyone. It can be a teacher, it can be a crossing guard, it can be an aunt, it can be a friend, it can be a coach. If that child has a committed, supportive relationship, they are more likely to be resilient. Because learning to cope with manageable threats, that's critical for the development of resilience. And the capabilities that underlie resilience, they can be strengthened at any age. And so while in general, toxic stress can lead to poor mental health, not every child exposed to it will suffer those consequences. And coping effectively is best seen as a response to a specific situation, not necessarily as a constant trait, because resilience is different for each child. It's fluid, it can change over time. What works in one situation might not work in another. And so we need to recognize and build on those strengths and promote those protective factors and those positive relationships to build this resilience. So I'm going to pause right there. If folks want to type in the chat, any thoughts they have right now on kids' behavior, are you thinking about kids differently or even about yourself differently? And if you need time to think about that, we can talk about it at the Q&A a little bit later too. And we'll keep monitoring, but I'll pass it over to Sarah. And if folks do end up typing in the chat, we'll come back to it, but I'll hand it over to Sarah.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was muted. Courtney, if you could go to the next slide, please, that would be great. So, Alli mentioned that we do have a specific diagnostic process for infants and young children. And as much as we want to focus on strengths, we also very much need to recognize when there are areas of struggle or challenge for infants and young children so that we can address those. And that often means that we go through a diagnostic process. With the DC 0 to 5 manual that Alli mentioned, we often say we diagnose disorders, not children. And we look for what are the set of symptoms that a child is exhibiting as a way to think about how do we think about next steps and supports for a child. So what the DC 0 to 5 gives us is a developmentally sensitive way to diagnose children, thinking about all areas of their development. What's developmentally appropriate for a child? And when we think about, let's say, a 26-month-old, we see a tremendous amount of frustration tantrums. We see children who often have a hard time re-regulating themselves after they've had a period of intense crying and frustration and need a lot of external support to come back to a state of being regulated. That's very developmentally appropriate. When we see that in a 4 or 5-year-old, that tells a really different story. And so having a developmentally appropriate diagnostic nosology is really important. The other piece when we're diagnosing young children to always hold in mind is the diagnosis that we give today may shift as the child grows and develops and responds to intervention. One of the main reasons we want to help families understand what's going on with their child diagnostically is so that we can get the appropriate supports in place to help the child to move forward and reach their fullest potential. So I'm seeing something in the chat here. Let's take a look. Is there a good trauma-informed way to bring caregivers' attention that they are not positively engaged with their child that contributes to how the child interacts with them? Something that reduces defensiveness. Oh, what an excellent, excellent question, Andrea. Thank you for bringing that up. It fits nicely with this piece about diagnosing because so often what we see is that children present to clinicians because they have a behavioral challenge. It may be the things that Alli just mentioned, eating, sleeping, toileting have gone awry, but it's often kids get brought in because of their challenging behaviors. They're about to get kicked out of preschool because they're biting everybody in sight and they're grabbing toys from other kids and they're screaming and they're hitting. Those are symptoms. Those are communications. They're saying to us, something is not right. Sometimes what's not right is that the relationship between the parent and the child is not optimal. That caregivers are not positively engaged with their child. From an infant mental health perspective, how we would address that is to be very reflective with the caregiver. How is your relationship with your child feeling to you right now? What are the strengths that you see in the relationship between you and your child? Asking the caregiver. Where are the areas that you feel like are struggles for the two of you? And very gently getting a sense of what their understanding is. Because when we hold this infant mental health lens, one of the things that is really foundational in our understanding of infant mental health is that the caregiver's own early relationship history, their relational vulnerabilities very much become interacted in the relationship that they have with their child now. Saw this meme the other day that captured this in it, I thought, just a brilliant way. It said, if you do not deal with your demons, they will raise your children. Those things that were visited on us early on in our own relationship history, if we don't address them, will very much play out in our relationships with our kids. When we hold an infant mental health stance, we're thinking about how do we meet that caregiver's needs? And I will tell you, I have seen this over and over and over again. A mom brings a child in that's just really struggling with this kid. He's hitting her. His behavior is out of control. The clinician focuses on the parent, says, what was it like for you when you were his age? Who was there for you when you had a need, when you were this age? And the mom says, oh, nobody was there for me. And the clinician provides a corrective experience that says, oh, that must have been so lonely for you when you were feeling so out of sorts and your heart was hurting and you needed someone to be there and they weren't there. And suddenly the mom feels that attunement from the clinician that she so desperately needed as a young child. And she internalizes that. And then she is a little bit more able to provide that for her child. And when we meet the needs of the parent, in infant mental health, we call this parallel process. They internalize that attunement and are more able to provide that for their child. And this is obviously a very Reader's Digest version of what's complex psychotherapeutic treatment. But it's very much about addressing the needs of both members of the dyad or all members of the family so that they feel filled up enough to be able to be there for their child. I'm seeing some more in the chat. And I had a kindergarten student that the parents were under 21 and divorced. She shared that her baby brother was put on a hanger. Oh my gosh. Had no context to know what that meant, but the next day the child was removed from her family because she had witnessed child abuse. The child had a wonderful thing in his situation. She had a lawyer because she was Native American. She was placed with her father, who was very young and inexperienced, called the lawyer the next day, and the child and the father had therapists and counseling. That's awesome. I taught her to write all of her experiences in a journal, many of them. The placement did not endure beyond the year, but I think the lawyer did say, stay with the child. Is that enough to stabilize the child? It's really hard to say in a situation like that. But what we do know is each support we put in place becomes a protective factor. A caring teacher who takes their time to listen to the child, to say, your thoughts, your feelings are so important. You can write them down in this special place and hold on to them. An attorney who fights for that child's right, that's a protective factor as well. And we always want to put as many protective factors in place as we possibly can to override and ameliorate all of those risk factors, because clearly in that situation, there were a lot of risk factors. But, Alli mentioned before, having that one person in a child's life who is willing to invest in them, who sees them, who hears what they have to say, and is present to them is the most healing experience that a child can have in a situation like that.
And I think too that holds those big feelings. Kids have big feelings. Adults have big feelings. And that can be scary and overwhelming to a child who's never, it may be the first time they've experienced that. And that's where the repair comes in too. And a lot of times you actually might see when we talk to a lot of daycare providers and teachers, they'll talk about how challenging the child is in the classroom. And then at home, they talk to the parent and they're like, oh, he never acts that way at home. And it's like, what if your classroom is the only place they feel safe to get out these big, scary feelings, whether those feelings are warranted or not? It also goes to the reflective piece of how are we interpreting these kids' behavior. This situation you're listing here, I have no idea the extent of the investigation that went into this case. But the hanger piece caught my attention because I'm like, what did that child mean by hanger? What if it was like totally, I don't want to say fine, but are we thinking of like a coat hanger? Because yes, that's bad. But what if it was like they were in like a sling and just like hanging like safely
It's a Johnny
somewhere?
jump up or something like
Right.
that.
Because I'll use a little bit of potty language. There was another story I've heard, and I don't know if it's true or not, but it goes to show like a child came to daycare and was like, oh, my daddy put his pee-pee on my pee-pee. And you're like, what? And your first instinct is to be like, this is terrible, this is scary. Turns out what he meant was that he had used the bathroom, didn't flush, and then his dad went in to use the bathroom after him. So his dad put his pee-pee on his pee-pee. So it's very much of like, we need to pause and we need to reflect. We need to look at ourselves also and think of like, when I see that child behaving a certain way, how am I interpreting that behavior? Also, like, how am I feeling today? Am I tired? Am I hungry and distracted? And I'm like, because as a parent, I've felt that too. There are plenty of times that I'm not my best self with my child, and I just have to go with that and give myself grace. But there are plenty of times when I can fully attune to her, and there are times when I can't. So just again, being reflective and recognizing how we're interpreting the kid's behavior.
And remembering, again, as Alli said, all behavior has meaning. And that kid who comes to school and, is really, really hard to deal with in the classroom. There's that old saying, the kid who's the hardest to love needs it the most. He's telling us something. And we may not speak that language just yet, but we need to keep figuring it out to interpret, what is this child's needs? Is this a sensory need, something neurological within the child that he is seeking a way to regulate his body and his nervous system? Or is this a relational thing? Is something scary happening at home and he doesn't have words to tell us? So, it requires a lot of fact finding on our part. It really requires us to be open and deeply reflective, to not come in with the idea that we have all the answers or that there's just one answer. This is complex work, multi-layered. It's the old artichoke. There's so many kinds of things. And I think Allie's example about the pee-pee is so illustrative. And it's like that with the behavior too. We have to figure out, what does this behavior mean to this child? Are they trying to tell me something? Most likely, yes, but it's up to us to keep digging until we figure out what that is. And often it's a multifactorial cause. There may be something neurological, there may be something environmental, there may be something relational. And it means that we need to pull together all of the important people in the child's life to work together to support the child and the family, and especially to come at it with a non-judgmental stance. That is a foundational concept in infant and early childhood mental health work, is that we seek to understand with empathy and leave judgment at the door. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. This talks a little bit more about this idea of diagnosis. And one of the things that going through a diagnostic formulation can help us to do is figure out these questions. What is it that's causing this behavior? So using a diagnostic process and using an empirically validated evidence-based diagnostic system like the DC 0 to 5 can help us in multiple ways, with things like having a shared language, so that when I say this is the child's diagnosis, Alli knows exactly what I mean by that, because she and I have both looked at the DC 0 to 5 and we're looking at the same set of symptoms. And that helps us to think about what are next steps to help this child and help their family. How do we put services in place for the family as well as the child? And then how do we determine what this child needs? What other professionals are going to support this child? If it does turn out that this is something physiological, it's a neurological sensory need, I might need to bring in an occupational therapist. If the child has some oral motor challenges, I might need to bring in a speech and language pathologist. Thinking about all aspects of the functioning, a diagnostic nosology like DC 0 to 5 looks at not only the behavior, they look at the cultural context, they look at the child's development, they look at the psychosocial stressors, and they look at the relational aspect. It's a multi-axial system. All of those things are given significant weight in creating a diagnostic formulation for the child. And then, this is always, unfortunately, part of what we have to think about is, how is this treatment, how is this intervention going to be funded? And often, in order to get insurance reimbursement or Medicaid reimbursement, we have to have a diagnosis. And so, it comes back down to being able to financially provide what the treatment is requiring. Okay, we can go on to the next slide. This slide is just talking a little bit about the process of a diagnostic experience for a child and family. It should never just be a one and done. a diagnostic process should feel like the beginning of help, that it's the beginning of a relationship between a clinician and a family, where the family feels heard and attended to, where their concerns are validated, where the child feels seen, where what they're trying to communicate through their behavior and what they're bringing to the school and at home is attended to in a deep and meaningful way. So, we look at a screening, which is a brief overall look. Is there a problem or isn't there? If that screening says, yeah, things don't look quite right, we go on to the assessment process. The assessment should be multifactorial. It involves observation. It involves interview with the parent. It involves watching the child interact in their natural environment. It involves observing the child and wherever that child spends time and with the important people in their lives, with their teacher, with their grandparents, with their peers, with their siblings. That helps us to come to a place where we have the ability to make a diagnosis. This child's symptoms fit within this pattern. And it helps us to create a diagnostic formulation that means we're understanding the whole child within the context of their relationships and within their environment, so that we can begin to craft a plan to provide the supports and interventions that will be meaningful in helping the child and helping the family cope with what's going on with the child, and addressing all the needs of the family members and not just the individual needs of the child. Okay, we can go to the next one. And I'm going to turn it over to Alli to talk more about the legislative and policy aspects of the work.
Yeah, and I'll go through this quickly. I'm not going to get into all the weeds of this, but this is what I do now. I used to be in direct practice and work directly with kids and families, but for the last 10 years, I moved into the policy world where I focus on early childhood policy and mental health policy. And there are lots of laws. This is only a few things that impact people and how they can do their work. But we've built a lot of strengths in Illinois. Rules 132 and 140 have to do with Medicaid, and that under Medicaid, it allows for the DC 0 to 5 to be used for kids who need a diagnosis. There's also the Children and Young Adult Mental Health Crisis Act, which, among a lot of things, it allows for preventive services for kids. So kids under 18 can actually get up to 6 sessions without having a diagnosis yet. So more of that preventive piece. There's also the Illinois Black Caucus passed legislation in 2021, Public Act 101-0654, which again required the use of the DC 0 to 5, but it also allowed for additional funding for infant and early childhood mental health consultants to go work in early childhood programs like childcare and preschool. And then clinicians can also bill for screening of children and caregivers. Next slide.
Oh, this is me. And I just tried to put in the chat, but I think it doesn't go to everyone, my email address, because I know some of you are clinicians, and Alli mentioned that we are now required as clinicians, especially anyone who is treating children who receive Medicaid, to use a developmentally appropriate diagnostic nosology, of which the DC 0 to 5 is really the only one. In order to be able to use this tool, you need to be trained. And those of you who are clinicians, if you want to receive training in the DC 0 to 5, there are several opportunities throughout the state of Illinois. I have one coming up. I do the 3-day clinical training for my students at Erikson, and there are usually some additional spots available, and I open those up to the community. So if you are a clinician and you're interested in attending that training, you can email me at smartinez, Martinez, at Erikson, ERIKSON.edu, and I can tell you about that DC 0 to 5 clinical training.
And we have a slide at the end with our contact info, and I'm
We
sure
do.
Courtney
Okay.
can share all of our information afterwards as
Oh, thank you, Allie. That's really helpful. Okay, so we talked a little bit in the prior discussion about the child and the concerns about is some of what treatment looks like, some of what intervention looks like. But when we think about infant mental health, it's really this kind of three-pronged approach where we think first about promotion, of holding this lens that parents have what they need to support their children's development. And if we can get in there and provide some supports for them, that promotes healthy development in infant mental health. And then we move into the next phase, which we would call prevention. So promotion is things like Mommy and Me Story Hour at the library, um, engaging in play with parents and kids together, childcare that really looks at the importance of holding a relational lens. Those are all ways we promote infant and early childhood mental health. Then we think about prevention. For those families where there are risk factors present, getting in and intervening early with programs like home visiting for teen parents or families who have less access to resources, who can have a home visitor who can support that parent's understanding of their child's development and their social and emotional needs, their relational needs. That can prevent later mental health problems and challenges. When it gets to the point where a child is eligible for a diagnosis, we certainly want to intervene. And there are multiple ways in which we can do that. There are multiple modalities that provide therapeutic services for parents and children. Ideally, that happens in the context of a multiple support system where there are several different practitioners who are providing supports and intervention for families. The cool thing about infant and early childhood mental health is you don't have to be a clinician, a psychologist, a social worker, a licensed counselor to hold an infant mental health lens. When we think about working from an infant mental health perspective, it means we hold a stance of being reflective and relationship based, and we hold the priority of the relationship in mind in whatever our discipline is. Whether we're a child care teacher, whether we are the school bus driver, everyone who can hold the perspective that kids have important thoughts and feelings that need to be addressed and attended to. We have to do that in the context of relationships, and parents need support to be able to continue to be present for their kids. We're holding an infant mental health lens, and it can be a multidisciplinary approach. Okay, we can go on to the next one. So I kind of got a little ahead of myself in talking about the multidisciplinary piece. Anything that promotes and supports the child's healthy development is aligned with an infant mental health approach, especially when that comes through the lens of cultural humility and honoring this family's deeply held cultural beliefs, values, and practices, and doing so in a way that respects those and incorporates those into any relationship that we have with this family. Doing that from a lens of reflection, where as practitioners, we frequently take a step back from the work and say, how is this going? What's the family's experience of this interaction that I'm having with them? What's the parent's perspective? What's this like for this baby? Am I holding the baby's inner subjective experience in mind? Am I helping the parent to do that? Am I employing this unique set of competencies that are infant and early childhood mental health informed in my work with this child and their family? And the key when we're holding this infant mental health lens is that it's never just the baby. It's always the baby and someone. I mentioned Donald Winnicott earlier, and he's very famous, and this line gets bandied about at Erikson, where he said, there's no such thing as a baby. And everybody's like, what? There's only a baby and someone. Because babies can't exist in isolation. that come as a package deal with a caregiver. And so an infant mental health approach says, I'm going to hold this dyad. Those of you who are clinicians, you know that often insurance will ask us to specify who is the identified client when we're doing family therapy or when we're doing couples therapy. When we hold an infant mental health approach, we think of the relationship as the identified client. It's our portal of entry to support the child and their development, to support the parent and their needs through the relationship. And we work in and through the relationship. Okay, we can go on to the next one. So what does this look like in practice? And there's so many different modalities and that have different portals of entry. Sometimes our portal of entry into treatment is really focused on the behavior. So a program like parent-child interaction guidance or parent-child interaction therapy is a method where the parent and child are in a room together. The parent has a little earpiece and the clinician is on the other side of a one-way mirror. And the clinician is watching the parent and the child interact. And the clinician is saying to the parent, hey, why don't you try handing him the blue block and saying, put it on top and see what he does. And the clinician is just kind of whispering some guidance in the parent's ear. And then when the parent starts to, feel a little lost, that maybe the kid's behavior starts to escalate, the clinician is there supporting the parent through this little earpiece. There are other methods where the portal of entry is more just around the parent. We're providing guidance to the parent and really digging deep into their own early relationship history. Approaches like infant parent psychotherapy focus a lot on what in infant mental health we often call ghosts in the nursery. What are the ghosts of relationship past that are rearing their presence up in this relationship? And we help the parent to see what it was like for them in their own early relationship history and how that may be being reenacted in their relationship with their child now. There are other particularly like trauma-focused interventions for infants and young children. An evidence-based model that is very widely used and is certainly the most empirically supported is a model called child-parent psychotherapy. It's frequently used for children who've experienced trauma, anything from natural disasters to child abuse, to a profound loss in early childhood. And it uses a combination of play therapy for the child. The child is able to use very specifically selected toys to act out challenges and feelings. And then the clinician is also helping the parent to see and understand what the child's experience is while holding the parent as well. Because, any of you who are parents who know, when your child experiences something traumatic, it's traumatic for you as a parent as well. So the clinician is really holding both members of the dyad. So those are direct service opportunities. Another very frequently used approach in infant and early childhood mental health is to bring in a consultant. So in a program like childcare or home visiting or early intervention, where there is some direct service going on to a child and family, an infant mental health consultant can come in. Let's use childcare as an example. The teacher's really struggling with a little kid in the classroom. This little guy is, biting and fighting and crying a lot, and the teacher is just feeling ill-equipped to deal with this child's issues. An infant and early childhood mental health consultant will come in and support the teacher, reflect with her around the child's experience, ask questions that help her to think deeply about what the child's needs may be, and help to build that teacher's capacity to be the one to meet the child's needs. The consultant isn't working directly with the child, she's working directly with the teacher to help build the teacher's capacity. So not only is she better equipped to deal with this child, she's better equipped to deal with kids who have similar challenges in the future. It's a very cost-effective way to provide infant mental health supports in our work. There's many additional ways in which we provide supports to families, everything from, concrete assistance of providing diapers and formula to crisis intervention when something happens in a community, and pretty much everything in between can be administered with an infant and early childhood mental health lens. But I won't go into more detail because I want to make sure we have time for Allie's last part as well.
Thanks, Sarah. And I'll go through this quickly. We call this the infant and early childhood mental health system. But because services are provided through so many different things, and because, like we've talked about so much, that baby does not live in a bubble, there really isn't an infant and early childhood mental health system, which can be unfortunate because then it gets diffused and people are like, well, who's handling what? And this is just kind of an illustration of the public system where you can see across the range of promotion, prevention, intervention, treatment. You've got things like home visiting that is more on the left side for that promotional piece of what are we doing to support all kids, infant and early childhood mental health. And then you move further along for that smaller and smaller set of kids who may need more prevention than more intervention and then actual treatment. Next slide. And for those mental health concerns, you can find, places for help at community mental health centers, federally qualified mental health or health centers, behavioral health clinics. A lot of hospital networks have really good programs, and then independent practitioners. And I'm going to fly through these next slides just to give you a snapshot. And please do not worry, you will get these slides and you will actually get the links and you can investigate all of these places. But Courtney, if you'll go to the next slide, here are quite a few. Beacon is actually a new portal in about the last year or so. That is an online and a phone number that you can call to find mental and behavioral health resources. And it's kind of like a single front door that will enable parents and caregivers and service providers to connect with state-funded and community-based services for kids. We have a lot of organizations in Illinois that are really great. The Children's Mental Health Partnership, the Illinois Association for Infant Mental Health, the Childhood Trauma Coalition, the Fussy Baby Network, which is located at Erikson. And then for developmental concerns, we've got early intervention and early childhood special education. Also on that that promotion side, we've got Illinois Cares for Kids and the Department of Early Childhood, where you can find high quality childcare programs, Head Start programs, home visiting programs, because again, those are considered a piece of infant and early childhood mental health. Next slide. I mentioned a few hospitals that do infant and early childhood well. Unfortunately, a lot of these are Chicago based. I know there are other places across the state, and I can update my slides a little more, but places like Rush University and Lurie, there's also the Collaboration for Early Childhood that will not provide direct mental health services, but will connect families to early childhood services. There's the Virginia Frank Child Development Center, the Infant Welfare Society. Next slide. Also, if you're in a program, Sarah mentioned infant and early childhood mental health consultation. Actually, that website no, that's the correct website. I'm sorry, I did update that. If you're a practitioner and you're looking to better and your reflective skills, this facilitating attuned interactions is a really good model that you can get trained in, and it's a way of interacting with kids and families and providers. Erikson, where Sarah is, has the Infant and Early Childhood Mental Health Certificate Program, and then the Illinois Association for Infant Mental Health has the credential. Next slide. There are also reflective learning groups and reflective practice groups across the state that providers can participate in. And when I say providers, that could be a clinician, that could be an early intervention provider, a home visitor, a teacher. Policy people can do it too. I've actually been through the credential as a policy person myself. And then Sarah's talked about the DC 0 to 5 clinical trainings, and you can just reach out to myself or Sarah because Sarah is one of our trainers in Illinois, and we have a handful of other trainers across the state who provide regular trainings that we can connect folks to. Next slide. Um, we've talked about 0 to 3, and then also the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard. They have some really great videos on trauma and brain development and neurons. Next slide. And so I'll take these, Sarah, because I really want to get to the video because it's like the highlight of the presentation. But we just want to kind of wrap up here talking about the importance of you. And if you go to the next slide, Courtney, infant and early childhood mental health, at first it might seem confusing, but really it's a simple concept and we all share ownership. This system functions on many levels. It's the caregiver, an administrator of a program, a clinician, all the way up to the government and advocacy. And basically, we have to respond to the needs of infants and their families. We have to be comprehensive, coordinated, and integrated. No one agency, no one person can fill all the needs of families and infants and toddlers and preschoolers. And so it's really critical that across our communities, our systems, that we are coordinated and that we are all sharing ownership to support each other and help our kids and ourselves and our communities thrive. And so if you'll go to the next slide, Sarah and I always like to end on this.
It's better. Espera, sem estar, hein? Peraí. Que susto! Eu vou cortar esse pontinho só. Oh, meu.
So this is infant and early childhood mental health. This is what we want for all kids, all caregivers. You can really see demonstrated that back and forth interplay between the dad and the baby, and the baby kind of leading and enjoying himself, but also, the dad's having a good time, but also dad might have been a little scared to clip the baby's fingernails, like, what if I cut my baby's fingers? But the baby's kind of like, hey, dad, it's cool. Like, I'm good. I feel safe. And, they're building off of each other and they're taking pauses when one time it might be a little overstimulating. They take a pause and kind of breathe and then they get back into it. But this just puts all of us in a good mood and, makes us feel like, hey, I can do this. If this is what infant and early childhood mental health is, I can do that.
So if you have questions that you would like us to address, please put them in the chat or, comments, thoughts. We would love to hear from you. Oh yeah, and here's our contact information. So if you are interested in DC 0 to 5 clinical training, feel free to send me an email and I can let you know when we have one of those to offer at Erikson Institute. Or if you really want to dig deep and you're interested in a certificate in infant and early childhood mental health, shoot me an email about that as well. We have some really amazing scholarships for our infant and early childhood mental health certificate program that combined can cover up to 90% of the cost of tuition.
Great. Thank you so much. This was really, really helpful. I'm gonna stop sharing.
We'll give folks a minute if anybody wants to put something in the chat. Sometimes it takes a minute to type it up. We can stay on for a minute. Well, thank you to all of you for participating this evening.
Yeah, giving up your evening time to hear us.
Thank you, Dawn. Thank you, Gilda.
And if you take some time later to process any of this and days from now have questions or thoughts, feel free to email us. We're happy to hear.
Yeah.
Courtney, thank you for arranging this and
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you
managing
guys
us
so
to make our
much.
slides
This was
and
really
all.
helpful. Yeah, this was really great. I feel like I learned a lot. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, and this webinar will be posted on our website after. So if you want to share it with anyone, please feel free to. There will be a survey afterwards that just asks a couple questions that really helps us just gather some information, and we'll share it with Alli and Sarah as well. So please take a couple minutes to fill that out. Yeah, thank you all for joining. We really, really appreciate it. We have our next webinar will be on September 10th. We'll be talking about sorry, lost my place. The Talk Save Lives for World Suicide Prevention Day. So if you want to join us for that as well, that will be our next webinar. So thank you so much, Alli and Sarah. I really appreciate it. And thanks everyone for attending. Yeah, thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
Good night,
Thanks,
everybody.
everyone. Have a
Have
good
a great
evening.
night.
Thank you all for being here. Bye. Courtney, thank you.